I'm doing pretty well. How are you doing, Mouse? What's up? Hello. We just got through some 15 minutes refreshing our kanji writing. And then we did the review for our platforms and floors and stuff. Now we can go in. Oh, that's a really cute animation. Wait. Wow, that's a lot. I mean, I don't know if you guys jump rope before, but that is an incredible hang time. I think if you're locking your knees, I think I could probably get 5 revolutions, but whew, what is that? Like 6, 7? Hold up. Yeah, like 6 or 7. Pretty impressive. Well, for a big guy, you know. If you lock your knees and try to do the jump rope, 6, 7 revolutions is pretty intense. Quite above average. I consider myself more of an average jump roper. Alright. You were thinking about yesterday's chat? I definitely could have used a better choice of words. A little immature on your part. I like to say you're 16, so I actually thought it was pretty impressive. Yeah, aggressive enthusiasm is probably what I would say. I actually find aggressive enthusiasm incredibly endearing. Now, I also was a little too direct, so it's nice to think that I think, to your credit, you were mature enough to not like throw it back at my face. Because taking into account the age, right, your age group, being that direct can lead to an emotional response. Although I do like observing kids who have, like, younger people with aggressive enthusiasm. I just don't really say much most of the time. But in this very specific case, like yesterday's, it was kind of thrilling. It was a bit thrilling. Yeah. Yeah, I hope I reckon that's not what you meant. I think it was unintentional for you. I actually think you care about learning a lot, and that's where that aggressive enthusiasm comes. And having like saying you're only 16, I still think it's very serious. You're thinking like a college student already. And when you walk into a college class, at least if I'm the professor, I wouldn't take anything you say very lightly. Aggressive enthusiasm, I usually take with a very serious tone. One, do not discourage people from being incredibly enthusiastic. So I go pretty deep when it comes to someone who especially types in long thoughts. I think you're the first one. Yeah, first one that's younger than 18 that's typed in complete thoughts. That's actually very uncharacteristic. So it was pretty intense. I appreciate it. One thing I did think about over the evening, I didn't give you the impression, well, it was very difficult because our meeting was a bit brief. However, I didn't give you the impression that I have already been applying a mix of a lot of methods. So it's not that I was disinterested in the natural approach. I actually agree with you statistically about the natural approach. I actually use 6 to 7 subtypes of natural approaches in learning with Duolingo. And I use Duolingo as the primary framework to use other strategies on top. So Duolingo, evaluating the product means that it has to be the centerpiece of evaluation. And then everything I compensate for is what I review. The first review that I've ever done so far is after 25 days. 25 days was when we completed section 1. I've set myself for a 30-day period. So either 30-day comes up or a section is complete. So section 2 is about 50% longer. So whichever comes first, day 60 or section 2 completion. I mean, I might try to ramp. ramp up, perhaps change up my cadence. Generally speaking, at those days, I will be doing like what I feel Duolingo applies, like their methodology, and what I use outside to bring to Duolingo. I typically want to mold things. I like to use tools for what they are and use my experience to complement it, as opposed to using a tool that is forcibly or characterized to meet all my needs. In terms of someone, I view learning as a sustainable thing, independent of tools a lot of times. So most of the strategies that I'm thinking of are independent of the tool itself. So I do recommend, lots of people have recommended LingQ for sure. I looked at LingQ, their aggressive monetization model and whatnot, and to substitute for the whole natural approach by listening to conversation, I typically, before I even use Duolingo to learn Japanese, I have already been listening to multicultural conversations. It's actually part of the typical, like if you were talking about learning methods, Fujonese, my first language, Fujonese, is entirely immersion. So it's 100% immersion. And like total immersion, it has its drawbacks. Since Fujonese is not taught with formal grammar or any form of schooling, I do not have any evidence of structural grammar translational methods that allow me to explain Fujonese like I would be able to explain my second language, which is English, right? And technically the second exposed language is Mandarin. However, during that time, around 5 years old, we exclusively moved to an English schooling. So there are a lot of techniques through my life. And usually I would say when it comes to learning approaches, it's an amalgamation of all of them. At this point, the thing that Duolingo does kind of well, really well, in fact, a little too well, is the grammar translation method. And then a little bit more on the audio lingual approach, right? Provided the person who's using Duolingo is speaking and imitating first. And then a part of the natural approach also takes into account the idea of when you are using auditory production, it can be normalized by listening first and through imitation, and then presenting and producing the actual one from scratch, right? If you were thinking about a time frame, I don't expect any form of rigorous sentence reconstruction yet for the first 3 months, at least for myself. This is technically the third language I've learned formally. I have used the grammar translation method and that the whole drilling and the 80-20 rule, right? The 80-20 principles when I was learning Spanish, which started in high school and goes on to college. And I usually stick to the 80-20 rule for other types of skills. So that's one that I'm really familiar with. Just to give you an idea of lots of the different themes of methods that have been, I just use my method. I don't call it anything. I don't sell anything. I just do these things and hope that you can tease apart here and there observationally whatever works for you. You kind of find it funny. Your true goal here is to examine Duolingo as a, however you seem to indicate you're learning Japanese. Any reason for not truly telling your audience the true reason for my streams? No, the true reason is to demonstrate me learning Japanese by using Duolingo. That is the true reason. When you ask me why am I learning Japanese, is to communicate and interact with the community. That's learning Japanese. When you say Fujonese, I don't know if I spelled that right. That's fine. Yeah, that is correct. It's my first language through immersion. Yeah. Do you mean that just as a general first language, as an infant exposed and is immersed to which generally considered? Yes, that is it. So to this day, I still speak to my parents in Fujonese. Its comprehension level is to the point where I do not, you have your Freudian slips, right? If I start speaking Fujonese, I will start using interjections and stuff in Fujonese until I decide if I can. So English and Fujonese are interchangeable. Talk to my parents. You get to that habit of interchanging all the time out of convenience. So like for example, 我先讲个 got giant. That's giant is an English word, but giant happens to be the name of our local grocery store. So 你明年要么 hospital. Eating is the hospital, but from time to time they know what the word hospital is. So me and my parents communicate just through immersion. So my parents have picked up English because my sister and I almost exclusively speak English to one another. However, we generally compensate by speaking Fujonese. And when you're thinking about like what does that mean, I have to think about what I said in Fujonese in English to explain to someone. So constructively, when you're in a total immersion, it comes as a feeling and a naturalness, as opposed to being able to explain it explicitly. Do I have any specific term for this? Kind of like how I speak Spanglish with my mom. Would you call this? Yes, I would call it the glish. Yes, I would call it the glish. I tell people all the time, as a multicultural person, I actually promote that idea. It's not to the consternation. I don't want to throw disrespect to people that are monocultural, right? And I'm not talking about monolingual versus multilingual, but monocultural perspectives on language versus multicultural. I inherently believe it's incredibly endearing when people are fluent in multiple languages and they blend back and forth because it's a part of their like rigor. They don't necessarily think of it too often. Like honestly, I say Dios míos sometimes. Like out of nowhere, I just say Dios míos. So from time to time, it just comes and goes, and there's some richness to that. And that's kind of how I feel about the perspective of my life experience. I'm not Chinese, I'm not American exclusively. So when I learn Japanese, I'm not really focused on learning Japanese exclusively out of its purity, to as humbly as possible to not disrespect the Japanese language. We have to compromise. So if my Japanese turned out to be a little bit weird, that's perfectly alright. I recommend you briefly saying that you are the result of East meets West. The quotes are for a good reason this time. I have already said that ad nauseum. So I am the poster child of East meets West, and that comes up. You'll probably hear it at least 15 times. I think I've said it at least 15 times in the last 28 days. How that influenced you to pick Japanese? Oh, okay. So about Japanese. Oh, you remember that. Oh, not that you recommend. Okay, yeah. I am the East meets West. And I love that. And I want to use that as a culturalism to spread linguistics. So the idea is doing this gives me the opportunity to talk to other people who strive to be somewhat multicultural, right? When you're learning through language. How did I pick Japanese? That's an interesting thought. The short story is media. So my hobbies deal manufacture-wise, like creative process. Lots of products come from Japan. So I already have a lot of ear training for Japanese, be it anime, classic films, business designs, cultural things. So like work ethic, behaviorisms, mannerisms, all that is steeped really deep from Japanese culture. So naturally, I picked this place because it's contentiously very, almost debatably antagonistic to the way English is approached. So even the culture of acquiring the two languages are very contrasting, right? And here we have at the intersection, Duolingo is actually a Latin South American led project in the United States using English as a platform to teach a Eastern language, which happens to be Japanese. So that's a less short answer of why this piques my interest, because now I'm usually using products trying to gather the perspective of the people who are making the product, just like the way I evaluate video games is often trying to come up with the perspective of what their goals are and what their intent and methodology is, not what I wish the product to be. I do show what my preferences are and how I constructively add to it. But in Duolingo, this happens to be an American English centric, but with a founder that is from Guatemala. So they have a Spanish English, right? American English and Spanish are very heavily coupled in the Western Hemisphere, especially the North American continent. So they're presenting a course through the guidance and development process on a Eastern language, which happens to be Japanese. And I'm not going to stop there. I'm kind of going down in the last path of least resistance, I suppose, if I'm correct about my own self-awareness, because Mandarin comes after Japanese. So then I will go back to Spanish, which I am formally trained in. So even then, a substantial part of Spanish is probably going to be review for me. Now that you mentioned the 80-20 method, rule, theory, whatever it's called. Yeah, whatever it's called. It's like named after that person. I call it the 80-20, etc. I know your goal most likely isn't fluency, but rather how effective the method is. But how competent are you in the Spanish language? Not so competent. My speech is non-existent now, so it's under practice, much like most muscles in the body. Vocally, speech is gone. I use Spanish almost entirely in the specific of gaming, right? Because in the North American region, Spanish speakers, they type in Spanish, right? So whatever comprehension is in that, and it's more a reflection of the immersion now, where because I only use Spanish in a specific context, that is the most salient part of the Spanish language. It's not to say that I don't have grammar and stuff that will come back upon review. So Spanish is following Mandarin. So when Japanese happens, it's more of a raw learning experience, in my opinion. And then Mandarin, I have a closer connection with when it comes to vocals and training. And in Spanish, I actually have formal schooling in that, and see how all those three types of starting positions change with the use of Duolingo. So I'm using 3 different levels of starting position. And Spanish is also the flagship of Duolingo, given that the priority was Spanish at first. And then English comes a close second nowadays because of English Corporation and the influence of English has as a secondary language. You know, it's pretty early, but how would you compare it to Duolingo, the 80-20? Oh, that's interesting. So right now, the path, I mentioned that yesterday, right? How the Duolingo path changed in 2023. I actually think not so subtly they applied the 80-20 rule. So they moved around the paths a lot. And the 80-20 rule, a part of the 80-20 rule is that when you focus on a very specific group, right? A very specific group that's responsible for the communication, the phrases they're doing are very classically some of the phrases that I've seen myself use already in conversation, or when I talk to people in conversation. So they actually restructured a lot of their paths to try to accommodate a little slice of the whole 80-20 method, where if you focus on the vocabulary that you will use in a conversation that's responsible for like 80% of conversations, like casual conversations, that's kind of the way they organize their units. So in section 1 and section 2 up to this point, you know how to travel, order food, apologize, greet, right? And no grammar points. no focus on grammar points. The 80-20 method tends to have a defocus on grammar points, much like the natural approach, right? You get the gist of things. Now, the downside, the contrasting thing about Duolingo is it's still corrected on correctness, right? Like, it's still error correctness approach. So that's like the whole, you got to correct yourself while you're going. So that's kind of a little bit of a hug from the whole, your like a more aggressive 80-20 approach, because there's a de-emphasis on grammar, and all the other natural approaches, there's a de-emphasis on trying to be right, like precision, but more like the exercise, and eventually that intuition will come into play. Duolingo does not do that. And that's one of the biggest criticisms, in my opinion, when it comes to anyone who practices an outside natural approach, which includes the 80-20 thing. You could be competent in one area of a language, reading, for example, and not at all. Yep. You can also be competent in all areas of language and fail to communicate properly. And that has very little to do with the components of speaking, writing, reading, and that comes, in my opinion, the area of emotional intelligence. A lot of perception of language learning deals with intellectual intelligence. How to speak, how to write, how to listen, like discern the mechanical nature of language. However, it requires emotional intelligence, which is the one that I prefer to focus on most of the time, like your motivations, your compassion, your ability to empathize and immerse in the cultural background of the use of that language. That's usually where I like to focus on, because yeah, I would say a lot of people have their own take on listening, reading, hearing, and speaking. There's a quick grammar correction from before. It would be Dios míos, not a Dios mío, not the again, right? And Dios is singular, not plural, although just so you know, that is not a natural approach. But all right, I'll take it. But actually, that is intentional. I did add the S intentionally, but you are not reading deep enough for why I say Dios mío. So a little bit about that later, but yes, Dios mío. Sure. Again, empathy, emotional intelligence, not semantics. So once again, it's about that whole hyper-correctiveness. It's kind of humorous, in my opinion, or maybe a little ironic, or that when you're one that mentioned how the natural approach is a method to doing things, right? Like maybe a little bit attractive. One of them is that, the whole grammar correction from before. So I've already established that I may or may not have retained the grammar of Spanish, whether I'm educated or not, because I'm under practice. However, in this very specific case, I actually did not do that unintentionally. So one has to also understand if I'm concerned about grammar. So unsolicited advice when correcting is something that a very aggressive and enthusiastic person may really be almost compulsively doing. But in this case, I actually do add the S for a different reason. But yes, I would agree with you if I cared about grammar at this point. You're just a bit confused of how emotion comes into play here. I also said that I don't use natural acquisition as my learning method. Plus, how I was supposed to know that you did that intentionally? You don't. You ask. And I share, right? So I'm sharing now, so do you feel guilt about it? I'm explaining to you why I added. Are you afraid to make mistakes? You just said that you don't use the natural acquisition, so okay, so that's my bad on the inference. Since you brought up natural acquisition last time, I figure there was a motivation to bring up natural acquisition. However, you don't. You make the mistake, or you might think it's a mistake, but all you received was an additional information from it, right? So the thing that may make you feel guilty is, like Duolingo, you are referring to right and wrong ways of expression as opposed to appropriate ways. So when you go out to say also quick grammar correction, as opposed to saying quick grammar correction, one could say grammar suggestion. Like, it's usually commonly used as Dios mío if you want to be grammatically correct. Not, you're wrong, here is the correct way of doing things. So that's emotional intelligence. That's not intellectual intelligence. I do feel that people who are very hyperly talented, especially at a young age, do not have command of emotional intelligence when communicating to people, much like offering unsolicited advice due to one's passion. So that's often an experience-based thing with language and communication as one gets older. I have not yet corrected you on anything. I have only corrected what I felt was you made a comment about something I did, and then I clarified it. So I have not made any correction to something that's unsolicited in response. And that's usually taking into account where that person's perspective is. So, like yesterday's conversation, my first inquiry is I wanted to ask you, what was your experience with Duolingo? And how do you use it or not use it right now? That's establishing emotional intelligence before offering advice. It's not necessarily bad or good. It's one of the normalized behaviors that I encounter as a streamer. So generally speaking, the older someone gets, the more experience they have, they tend to have enough experiences to intuit emotional intelligence. One, as in, instead of being afraid of making mistakes or thinking about things being wrong and right and how I'm supposed to know all these things, you don't. You don't know all these things. And that's kind of the natural ability to form communication to not make one feel guilty. At least I'm not trying to make you feel guilty of anything. This is just the natural part of communication. You're not afraid to make mistakes. I talk to people all the time in the languages. I'm learning and make mistakes all the time. You are only learning to, in my opinion, humbly so, you are only accepting those mistakes of which you aren't feeling guilty about. So when you ask the question, how am I supposed to know that you did that intentionally? You don't. But why are you asking that question if you're not worried about making mistakes? You don't. You don't worry about whether you know if I intentionally did it or not. The idea is you wait for my response. However, you made it so that it's about being right, as opposed to being sharing. So in my way, you did not offend me in any way in inferring or even assuming, really. I don't usually get offended by people assuming anything. I mean, I'm generally a multicultural person, so a lot of assumptions are made, and they're usually not quite on the mark, and I'm very comfortable with that idea. As someone who needs to exercise this, I must communicate that generally speaking, I will subvert most people's expectations only because I don't adhere to a single monocultural perspective. So if someone asks me, oh, your mother must be different now that she lives in the United States. No, I have a tiger mom. All right. And then someone's like, well, your dad must be like, some businessman or a doctor or something. It's like, no, he's retired. Pretty relaxed. Complacent. So all of that is, you're going to have that. So the idea is, if you're speaking to someone, emotional intelligence would prep you for language to be used in a way that's like, oh, I'm sorry if I'm too bold, but may I ask, right? How do you feel when someone corrects you? Well, I didn't want to I hope I didn't give you the impression that I'm correcting you. I'm clarifying, as in, you can't possibly know everything, and I can't possibly know everything. And you always say fluency is through being understood. Well, in a way, I disagree with you if you're using English. So far, I didn't mean to say quick grammar correction in a way of right or wrong, but because I wanted to help. That's aggressive enthusiasm, yeah. I used a different phrasing that was a little bit direct. I call it toxic compassionism, and I wanted to normalize that because directness can be viewed a bit as toxic, but toxic comes from an endearing need for compassion, and that compassion is to help, but the compassion can be lacking of emotional intelligence. So what I mean by that is, you can be very emotionally intelligent of yourself. Like, your need to want to help in your way is an act of compassion. How you help someone by not understanding what, if they want help or need help or their perspective, is empathy, right? And that's another branch of emotional intelligence. So when you go out and say, I only want to help, I would say, depending, there's a big dependence. I would give you a coin flip if that person felt like you either intervened unsolicited, or they would be very grateful. In this case, I'm a bit of a mix. If you go up to like a Japanese person and they're like doing their own business, and then you're like, I only want to help, that's a very westernized thing to do, right? Am part of American. There is part of me that really want to go out of my way to help people. My Asian side, my Chinese side would say I typically would help when solicited. Yeah. But please don't say that I lack general emotional intelligence and that I was trying to say you were wrong and I was right, because I am a major anti-language prescriptive this. I don't believe there's any right way to speak a language. Dialects emerge every day. It's just in the case of learning language, most people want to, for a lack of a better term, professional linguistic registers. All right, I'm not going to say it, but I hope you read that, right? Like, see, this is what I mean, but I won't say it. Now I don't have to say it. You just read back what you've just written. It's completely unfilling and detached. I don't prescribe to people who take one side or the other. So being an anti-language prescriptus, I don't mind people who like to be monolingual. If I'm anti anything, I wouldn't be able to exercise emotional intelligence to meet them halfway. So in my opinion, I'm not going to go any further with this. You just marked yourself in black and white, in my opinion. And I do believe dialects emerge every day. Your behavior and your way you're speaking would suggest something you are not, is my confusion here. You speak and claim to be something, yet you talk to me and explain things in a different manner. So if fluency is your goal in the way in understanding, let's go back to that point earlier about fluency is about always being able to convey something. I'm going to say a yes and a no if you're choosing English. We both speak English. probably pretty proficiently. And yet we spend a large majority of time talking about what we're trying to express, right? There are specific languages like English that will naturally lead to misunderstanding. If you look at the statistics for English, you're going to encounter the idea that those who are considered native English speakers are highly and way in the minority. So as an English speaker, I would say fluency is characterized by the ability to resolve misunderstandings, as opposed to always being consistently able to express what they're trying to say. For me right now, if I tossed away language, just toss away the concept of language, you are constantly saying something that I don't believe I'm getting that impression from. Perspectivism is generally something that is frowned upon. Prescriptivism, okay, similar to racism. So painting myself black and white and saying that I am an anti-racist would be saying something that I'm not. When you agree that sometimes you do have to do that, sorry for continuing, but I just wanted to understand what you meant by that. So, the answer, in my opinion, is all of the above. So yes, I agree with you, but you don't do that. You legitimately contradict yourself all the time. So what I mean is, first, you talk that you need to do this, right? And I agree with you, you do. And then suddenly, when you say you don't need to do this, you're doing it. And I can't really exercise any particular example. But if you're an anti-racist, for example, I guess you would have to encounter and appreciate racism in order to be anti. So I'm thinking grays, not black and whites. Yet, when I tell you you're lacking specific parts of emotional intelligence, you think it's all generalized emotional intelligence. Yet I went through great lengths to say there are spheres of emotional intelligence that are typically underdeveloped by someone so young. And only time will allow you to have experiences, to accumulate enough experiences to communicate with many different people. It's a thing that takes time, just like language. So it's not a bad or a good thing, it's the human condition. Yet you find that everything I say is polarly white and black and white. In other words, you're saying I can choose a side, but in general, I shouldn't state it publicly. You can probably state it publicly, as long as I suppose it depends. Again, it depends on the person. But for myself, I don't mind if you state that. I'm not saying you shouldn't. You never talk about these things, not even in debate classes. Yeah, I think you're fine. For me, it's great to understand where you stand. And the only reason I'm mentioning these things is I'm getting an impression that you want to be something, right? You want to be taken and recognized as. And I am explaining how I interpret your action. They're going to be very different if you talk to a different person. I actually think the stuff you say might not even be interesting to other people. For me, it's quite interesting. You have a hyper attention to categorization, and that you're gonna have hit and misses with other people. For me, it's really interesting the language you use, like prescriptivism, racism, professional linguistic registers. I have to say, you do strike me, you do bring a bit of nostalgia of my older self. Lots of I'm imagine you're a lot more well behaved than I am. However, when I was younger, I was incredibly detached. So I would use a lot of esoteric jargon that is actually honest to myself. However, it lacks the ability to express and communicate to my peers around me. You don't even talk to your mother about this? Why not? She only knows I like language but never gotten this political before? Why not? Political. Interesting. Do you happen to live in a place where politics is something? I think the branch that we're talking about here is emotional expression, as opposed to political, like semantics. Political semantics, like are you anti this, are you anti that? I'm largely talking about the ability for an intelligent person to connect with another person emotionally. One of the things that I've done over my life, when I was 16, I barely talked to anyone because my comprehension was not on the similar length, like thought. As I grew older, my speech slowed down. So I've largely slowed down and I speak very differently. So right now, let's kind of make this relevant to language. So for English, someone asked me what my English proficiency is. Well, generally when I'm streaming, I only use a really small a very refined subset of the English language. And then when I enter another like environment, I would use almost a pretty exclusive new set of vocabulary. And right now, this conversation we're having is actually non-traditional of the language, of the vocabulary that I use. So oftentimes when people talk about fluency, it's kind of difficult to characterize without thinking about the 80-20 thing, right? Sometimes if you're using 20% of vocabulary for a specific discussion or a specific environment, and then you go to a different environment, emotional intelligence helps you kind of curate how much of that 20% stays or it substitutes for another 20%. So I don't sound like this when I'm teaching someone something. I don't sound like this when I'm playing video games. So it kind of ebb and flows. And that's where I have me personally, so this is a expression of my own opinion, I have problems with the idea of fluency or the idea of expressiveness. Being expressive is not just bound by intellectual intelligence. So understanding all the nuances of a language doesn't necessarily help you express your emotions and connect with someone from a specific culture. Language helps, for sure. However, feeling someone out is an entirely different subject matter. And when I was younger, I was really interested in the acquisition of knowledge. And that knowledge made me a very, very unrelatable kind of person. So I was incredibly not down to earth, almost intimidating. And then I was possibly not like you, I was pretty hot-tempered. So a lot of times I go out of my way to think of corrections, like, well, technically this is not correct. Well, technically I want to help you, but you're just wrong here, kind of thing. And nowadays, that's why natural acquisition is kind of attractive, because now it's no longer about, even if you're trying to help someone be correct or you being correct, it's less of a notion of just getting the vibe and the feeling of getting the point through, even with broken grammar and not broken grammar. It's really irrelevant in terms of the motivation. Well, one could argue it's a mix of both, especially with what we argued about gray areas and such. And here's the thing. I wouldn't use the word argue. I would use the word discuss. To have an argument, my take on arguments would be a lot more aggressive than this. I am not convincing you to change your mind. That's an argument. I do not agree with the use of argument if no one has an agenda to convince each other something. Arguments tend to deal with a lot of gaslighting and persuasive content or persuasive language, and I'm not in the habit of convincing you or changing your worldview. This is a discussion where two people share possibly contrasting or similar points of view, but I have no goal of changing the way you think, which is usually what arguments are about. You're trying to rectify or alter someone's perspective. There's no goal of that. Honestly, I completely agree with you. Isn't black and white? Even if you stand on one side of the line, it's inevitable to dip. Yes. Very well said. Dip into the other side because you need to understand both sides in order to dance. Yes. My stance changes as well, right? So in case of language learning, I don't like to get a goal of fluency. I can resonate with that. I can empathize with not desiring to set a goal of fluency. And I'm always comparing myself to the CEFR scale. Call me ignorant. I have no idea what that will ever be. And probably not interested unless someone really has some emotional problems with CEFR. That's my motivations to do most things are my intrinsic need to understand someone emotionally. So this definitely changes your way of thinking. I see. Yeah, no intentions of doing like a JPLT for Japanese. I don't think I've had any way of officially standardizing my English proficiency anymore, so there's that. And then, you know, a bunch of people have asked about my IQ, for example. So all those standardizations have gone by the wayside for the most part. Unless someone is incredibly emotionally dependent and vigorously having a tough time solving some sort of intellectual problem with it, my interest is usually not piqued. And my personal hobbies do not usually adhere to standardization. I spent most of my life in standardization. At least in your definition of argument, it can be synonymous with discussing. Yeah, depending on context. Fair enough. That's usually how people use the word discussion and argument. So I will keep that in mind, and then I like to share with you that I do distinguish between the two. An argument in my context involves an active need to convince someone else to take your perspective, as opposed to the intellectual mutual sharing of agreeable or disagreeable discussions with no like input of pride or loss of pride or something, right? By the way, I'm almost 100% certain you've heard of that scale just in other terms. That's fine. Natural acquisition, I suppose. I probably heard of it. I agree with you, probably. At the moment, much like when you talked about the solar system things and natural acquisition, when you're throwing jargon around, I don't know, right? It's the difference of how you say something in a word versus expressing it. So at this point, I have no idea what DFR is. Perhaps with details, I might, but I don't think it's germane to our discussion here. I'm a much older and more emotionally inclined kind of person nowadays. When I was younger, I was detached and very intellectually recluse. So, usually that makes you unapproachable, right? People will ask you for help, and you will typically offer the help. However, if you look at your expression and foundations, if you're not already expressing your opinions and your stuff to your own parents and maybe your siblings, if you have any siblings, or even close friends, in the way that I do with friends online, that's usually how practiced you are. It's a excellent exercise in determining if you actually practice emotional intelligence as much as you think. Last time you didn't want to explain, but how about this time? I'm still a little confused at the idea of emotional intelligence, but I think I'm learning. Um, I'm not really being so here's one. I'm not really being too emotionally intelligent in our discussion here, right? I'm not I think you resonate a lot more with the being explicit. If I were talking to someone else, I would ask them, how do you feel about Duolingo? And they would say something which is very common that I encounter. Here's an example, an anecdote of this. I would ask them, well, how do you feel about Duolingo? And they would say, well, Duolingo sucks. I wasted 6 months of my time, and now I found out that Anki with a combination of LingQ is very useful. Like, okay, can you explain to me how you feel that Duolingo failed you, and what did you pick up when using Anki and LingQ that differentiates with Duolingo? And you start with that, then you offer your opinion or advice, right? Because the framework is to be able to understand what the background of that person is before offering help. That's one of the bigger indicators that someone prioritizes. It's a different facet of approach that is very common distinguisher. It's not the only distinguisher, but usually first impressions are very defined by whether someone is interested in the person before offering something versus if they're offering something out of their own need to help someone. Don't get me wrong, I absolutely love helping people. However, you have to ask yourself if they want help first. And usually that comes with a lot of discipline. It's one part that is not the same as this person is suffering. I see that this person is suffering. Or this person is sad. I can see that this person is sad. That is one of the basic understandings, in my opinion, one of the foundations of it. Now, it gets a little more complicated when people get older or they have more experience. It's like, wow, this person is really stressed out. I should really help this person. And then suddenly, an hour later, you realize this person wants to be stressed out. And the only reason they're getting better at the thing they're doing is that they're deliberately being stressed out, intentionally. So effectively, if you offered and intervened your advice, you would naturally have hindered their progress as opposed to offering help for their advice. So an emotionally intelligent person would probably ask, hey, you seem a little stressed out. Is this normal? Or is this good? And then the person would respond, right? And then it removes all doubt. However, a lot of times when someone doesn't practice emotional intelligence, their first inclination is, I know better. Or you might not think you know better, but you act as if you know better, and you offer the advice on the pretext that you are very confident in your inference from that split second that you understand what that person needs. And that's like a grammar correction or a fun fact regarding the mistake that they made consistently. Things like that, right? It could be a cultural difference. It could be a cultural difference. And that is responsible for establishing emotional intelligence, for sure. Not lack of emotion. No, I don't. They're not mutually exclusive. I think now we're having an argument. I disagree that cultural differences and emotional intelligence are mutually exclusive from each other. Emotional intelligence and intellectual intelligence is an umbrella of interpreting cultural differences. Like, without emotional intelligence, you can't actually, in my opinion, tell there's a cultural difference. The whole idea that we're having an emotional dissonance right now is the idea that we have a cultural difference. Right? I feel a certain way about certain things, and that makes that cultural difference. At least where you grow up, people throw advice around all the time. That's monocultural perspective. Yeah. So when when everyone around you throw around advice all the time, and you meet someone online, your normalized behavior is to presume the highly chance that the person would want advice when it's normalized. Interestingly enough, both my emotional awareness due to my cultural difference with you is I ask first, right? So is it part of emotional intelligence? My answer is both. It's both emotional intelligence and cultural differences. I think you don't like being called emotionally unintelligent. I don't know if that's a thing, but your your attempt to separate them so that you can ascribe it to cultural differences and a lack of emotional intelligence. I think I probably want to stop suggesting that you're deficient in some sort of fundamental personality. So instead, I would probably agree with you in order to make you feel more comfortable, right? It is a cultural difference, for sure. I agree with your assessment in that part. Okay, how about saying, I notice you are stressed. Are you okay? Do you need help? Yeah, yeah. And that's not specifically for me. I think you're okay. You're definitely okay with just blurring out advice. One thing I have to stress a lot is when people offer advice to me, there's a chance if I don't see it as advice, I will not like give it a lot of attention, right? And I've encountered a bunch of people who can become a little offensive about it, or like they become offended by it, right? Like someone states like, oh hey, you made a mistake here. Like, yeah, I know I made a mistake here, right? And the person's like, oh yeah, you do know this is the right answer. It's like, yeah, I do know that's the right answer because I made the mistake and I saw the right answer. However, that can come off as being very ungrateful. So when you offer advice based on inference, you also can get blowback, and then it would lead to some disagreement, which has happened in previous days. I understand being open-minded is important, and I'm working on that, but it's hard to just change my habits. It is, absolutely. And no rush, right? Like you said before, I want to echo the nice thing about being 16, right? The nice thing about being 16 is you give me the impression that you are extremely brilliant. And I get a little bit of nostalgia from the way you hold yourself. Like the complete sentences, the complete ideas. I'm absolutely reminded of my younger self. At the same time, I no longer sound like my younger self. I've been in the presence of very brilliant people who they speak at a different level. And unfortunately, I just don't understand them. Right? Especially ones that have been doing all your life. But you're 16, you know. Life has a magical way of putting two people together that don't characteristically come together, and one can end up laxing or changing or ebb and flowing. You might not change at all. That's also a possibility, right? So can my advice be seen as an innocent mistake or a lack of cultural awareness instead of having a superiority complex? I don't think you have a superiority complex. I see a lot in just a brilliant person, a brilliant younger person who I imagine you interact with a lot of friends, right? Do you have friends your age that are just as like I suppose higher aptitude. Like, do you have people around you that are typically of that higher aptitude? Generally speaking, I'm going to tell you where I live, the culturalism around 16-year-olds. That's some, you have dialogue that would make quite an impression, but not necessarily a relatable impression to 16-year-olds around where I am. Think of it as a chance where you can give advice to your younger self, like in the movies. I do. I do. I know a couple really brilliant peeps, and they get over the years of communicating, I think one has become more expressive because there was one that is incredibly complacent, so he doesn't express anything, and he doesn't have the urge to express anything. And then another one that has the urge to express everything, but not quite in a tactful way, right? So I've encountered plenty of people, like younger self. My younger self was bad. I use the antidote all the time. I had a bad temper. My temper was coming from the frustration of a combination of multiculturalism, being discriminated against. So, I had a lot of evidence of outside discrimination against myself, like against me. That's besides the point. The other one was I just couldn't resonate with anyone. Like, for example, you sit in an English class and I'm like, dude, this grammar stuff is awesome. And then everyone's just complaining about grammar. Right? And then that's what happens. Hey, yo, Indy. Genki desu ka? Genki desu. I'm gonna be honest, I have some acquaintances in school who have a similar way of thinking to me. Nice! But I don't really hang out with them. Oh. I have friends that I talk to that I've known for years, but we usually only crack jokes and talk about video games. Man. However, we don't have any classes together, so we usually only talk when we hang out. On the other hand, I have a lot of classes with the others, and that's where I get to talk about topics I care about, like calculus and geography. Yeah. Yeah, so do you yeah, the whole cracking jokes and talk about video games. Yeah, so I'm not sure if you have, it doesn't sound to me that you might have a friend where you can really let loose on the way you present yourself. And it's a shame that you have acquaintances that kind of think like you, but didn't have the coinciding like events to talk to each other like that. So it is weird that you feel more like yourself when I talk with people other than your friends. Yeah, I'm not gonna say that's weird because that's how my childhood was like. My childhood was that. Not only do I have a cultural difference, I'm also multicultural. So everything I said was not like myself, right? I spent most my childhood trying to fit in, or had the desire to fit in. Kind of, to some extent. And it's always been half there, half this, half that, and eventually it becomes normal, right? So I wouldn't say it's weird from my perspective. However, when you grow older, so like as you grow older, you have to often ask yourself, can you keep doing that? As in, is it okay that you always just never really feel like yourself? And that's kind of a tough question, especially for someone who hasn't been able to find a colleague that think just like them. Not saying it won't happen. In college, because of, when you go to college, you kind of refine your interest. You increase the odds of that happening. Statistically, as you refine and continue to think about how you can find the communities you belong to, your odds go up. And a lot of it also comes down to college and stuff. So when I went to college, I actually met 3 of my best friends. And the reason why I have to say 3 of my best friend is because they're identical triplets, right? And these guys are like brothers from another mother. Like, I cannot explain how intrinsically inexplicable how similar we are. So that can happen when you set the opportunities to do that. So oftentimes, when people would say, how do you attract people that allows you to express yourself properly? And that's where I'm talking about emotional intelligence, where you can have all the skills on how to help people. Now, use those skills perhaps over time to express it, project it in a way that will attract people like you. And then one day, in my opinion, when you're 30 or 40, you'll have 2 or 3 people who you would bend over backwards to help, and they would bend over backwards to help you. And there's no word or communication to explain that resonance. And that's kind of the whole emotional intelligence thing. And I was very blessed. I would say I'm very privileged to have bumped into not just one person. They just happened to be brothers. And we did everything. Pretty much everything. We had all the same classes, all the same. Like, it was a remarkable time. Now we don't hang out, right? Because we all grown up, we're adults, we have our separate lives. However, it only takes 10 minutes to catch up with like 6 to 7 months of void time. It's one of those things. At least that's... Alright, what did you do, Indy? What did you say? You said... Okay. Genki desu. Nice. Oh, what is this? Nihon something, no. Something. Oh, wait. Is that like speak? Nihongo no... How's learning Japanese going or something like that? Oh my god. Like, I can't... Man, I need to increase the font size of Twitch chat because it is very hard to see the more complex kanji. I don't recognize what's after no. Is it like, how is learning Japanese going? How's the Japanese going? Is probably what you said. How's learning Japanese going? Nice. Nice. Not that I'm not happy when I hang out with my friends. We have fun playing games, hanging out, playing soccer, etc. It's just that they aren't interested in the more specific things I like, whereas I can resonate and, lack of a better term, let out my nerdy side with those acquaintances in my AP class. Absolutely. So yeah, I think that's nice. That's pretty much what I don't want to put you in a box, but statistically, if I were to hear that a high school student behaves that, being very brilliant and applied, that's usually the behaviorism that would scream as a healthy person, right? So I wouldn't be concerned about your emotional intelligence at all. After high school, I spent most of my time thinking about being more emotionally intelligent instead of intellectually intelligent. It was nice to have, like, knowing, what to say, when to say, how to say it correctly. When I went to college, you had to do something else, which is, like, how to sound relatable is one of the big ones. Like in interviews and getting hired or working in a team, a lot of times you don't necessarily get the choice. You could end up getting the choice if you get lucky, like someone selects you, you're really brilliant, and you get the choice of that. My life took me in a place where I didn't have control over it, and oftentimes it led me to developing skills that allow me to blend without needing to sound smart. Or what I mean by that is without sounding correct. In fact, here's one funny issue, or not issue, or maybe not. I don't think I've openly told people this. I like making mistakes in the sense that mistakes are opportunities to feel relatable. So oftentimes if you ever hang out long enough, I'm always doing something that I'm incompetent in. Like very incompetent. Like I'm not going to tell you I'm learning Japanese the right, like a good way. My goal is to learn it a way and then watch me scramble through it. I haven't worked in a professional setting in a long time, so I do not offer any form of actual professional advice. I'm not paid. I haven't been paid to take up a position where what I do has some sort of reputational consequence. It's been a while. So nowadays, I'm this, what would you call this? This hipstery. I have this hipstery like approach, which is kind of funny because you mentioned natural acquisition. I would say that's probably fairly accurate on my hipstery approach to things. So when people go around and say, this is the best thing, this is the right and wrong thing, you're gonna have me say things like, well, it's gray, and are you happy? If you're constantly having this urge to correct someone when they're wrong, that sounds like someone who gets triggered, even also slightly, every single time. And the reason why I get ahead of that is I'm a person that makes a lot of mistakes. I don't usually stream things that I'm competent in. I only share experience. I vigorously share experiences in which I am incompetent in. And generally that's why learning is the method of focus. My learning methods are things that I accumulate over time. All the semantics and the context, like language, Japanese, like specifically Japanese and cultural stuff, I'm gonna get all that like wrong all the time. Like wrong, right, what have you. It offers an opportunity for someone else to come in and share. So I become less intimidating. Yeah, I become less intimidating. To me, I prefer someone who thinks I'm less educated and less scary or less smart as a way to build trust. That's kind of how graduate school does. Like that's how, at least in the United States, that's where the whole idea of graduate school happens. When you walk in through that door, most people are of equal footing, as in like the Japanese behaviorism of being business polite. When you walk in, I take you seriously. I don't care if you're 16. I don't care if you're like someone with 18 years of experience. You're a human being that have a perspective that, even if it's limited, it is informative. Like because it's limited, like what you are is informative to someone that is not like you. So being 16 is something I can never be ever again. And the older I grow up, the older I get, the less and less I'll know about what it's like to be 16 anymore. Especially in a different country, in a different growing environment, like different culture. So it's inevitably always intellectually stimulating. And no matter what, I am generally semantically inaccurate. Much like my approach to language. And Japanese people are probably going to dislike me. That's okay. As long as they know I'm a foreigner. Because their system allows it that foreigners get leeway, and I'm certainly not offended because I am a foreigner. You know? That's kind of the idea. You can continue to be this way, like, go for it. I think just like learning languages, by the way, just collect all of it, in my opinion. What's another tool in your belt, you know? Just like, have to go do some video editing? Oh, no worries. What time do I stream to? This is a full day, so I am gonna be on for another 5 hours. 5 to 6 hours. We have yet to learn anything. So feel free to stop by. I would love to know what you're editing and what you're working on. That'd be awesome. Yeah. Enjoy video editing. 16. Indie, listen. Is that what kids do these days? Indie? Do all kids edit videos at such a young age? Man. Think about it, Indie. When you wait, Indie. Tell me. When you were 16, did you have video editing things? I didn't even have a video editing thing. Wait. Oh no, there weren't even smartphones when I was 16. Now that I think about it. I guess the internet has been around for quite some time. Alright.